Good morning, church. Good morning, Christian Church of Olney. Good morning, Christian Church of Olney youth. Good morning to all of our Christian brothers and sisters scattered throughout the world. This morning, I want to bring you another message about Jesus Christ, who is the King. He is and was and is to come. And it's really been put on my heart to help explain what it means for Jesus to be the Christ, to be the King, to be the Messiah. What does that mean? Why do we say that? Where does that concept even come from? It's crucial as a Christian that you understand that Jesus is the King. That is the whole ball of wax. That's the whole thing. Yes, Jesus came to forgive us of sins. Yes, Jesus is the great high priest. Yes, Jesus did come to make us right with God and all that stuff. But if you cannot accept that Jesus is King, then you are not a Christian. Because a Christian is one who believes that Jesus Christ is King. That's what it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. It means that you have surrendered to his lordship. Now, one of the problems with growing up in the 21st century and in being a person who's alive and well in the 1900s is that we don't really have kings anymore. There is still a monarchy in England, and so we understand it a little bit in that way, that there are people on the earth who are exalted above all the other people, and they, by nature of who they are, by nature of their birth, by nature of their strength, they are kings and queens over the rest of us. But that is pretty foreign to most of us these days, because we do this democracy stuff. We have our governments and we elect people, and you can like Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump or like Barack Obama or hate Barack Obama, but we know that they're not our king because we elected them. All right. So, and they're going to be there for 4 years or 8 years or whatever. So we really have a lot of difficulty understanding what it means to have a king and to be under the lordship of a king. You know, the way that we understand this the best is maybe by watching old movies where you have some king ride in on a white horse and lead the people and get rid of the bad guys, and then they put the crown on them, and then they live in peace forever. And that's what Jesus is. Jesus is the king. Now, there's a lot of stuff about Jesus's lordship, about Jesus's kingship, that's really important for us to grab onto and to understand, because there are different religions in the world, and some of those religions do trace their roots back to Abraham and some of the other characters in the Bible. There's the three main religions in the world from that tradition are Christianity and Judaism, or being a Jew, and Islam, or being a Muslim. And those three religions will trace their roots back to some similar characters, notably Abraham in the Old Testament. So what makes Christianity different? Why does Christianity distinguish itself from what it means to be a Jew or what it means to be a Muslim? There's a lot of things, but the first thing and the most important thing is that we believe and affirm that Jesus Christ is the King of Israel. Jesus Christ is the Messiah, that Jesus Christ was sent by God to be the Son of God, to live and rule as King over mankind forever and forever. That's what Christians believe. Now, I want to explain to you where this comes from in the Bible. This might be a little bit of a lengthy video. I don't know. I try to keep these short, under 15 minutes. I kind of feel like this is going to be a little bit longer, so, bear with me on that. But we'll just see what we can do and get through. But it all gets started in the Old Testament, which, by the way, the Jews affirm the Old Testament. They don't affirm the New Testament because that's about Jesus. The Jews affirm the Old Testament, though. Similarly, the Muslims, they affirm the Old Testament, or at least parts of it. So these are the scriptures from antiquity that we all point to and say, this is where the ideas come from. So we're all looking back at these scriptures and trying to understand, what do they mean and how do we understand them? How do we interpret them in a modern day context? But basically what had happened after Israel had been released, from Egypt, they went through the Red Sea, and Moses led them through that. And then, the tribes were established, and there's all sorts of, the Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus and all that kind of stuff had been established. Israel had been living under this form of government for some time. And Samuel was the prophet. He was the priest in Israel during those days. He was in charge of the priestly duties because there was not a king of Israel in the early days of Israel. Instead, they were ruled by the law that God gave them. And by the way, doesn't that sound like America? We don't have a king. We're ruled by the laws that God gave us. So in America, we're very much in a similar situation to Israel, because in the early days of Israel, they were ruling themselves by following God's law. And if problems arose, if evil crept into the land, then God would raise up a judge to fight back against evil in the land. And so that's like Samson's a great example of that. Israel is supposed to be following in the laws of God, but, they would stray away, and then God would raise up a person like Samson to defeat evil, and then they would get back to following God in the way that they were supposed to, the way that God had intended them to follow him, because God himself wanted to be their king. God did not want to raise up a king over Israel. But eventually Israel got tired of this up again, down again, up again, down again thing. Bad guys would come into their territory and they would want to get rid of the bad guys. And they said, you know what, we need a king. And the king can be in charge of driving out these bad guys so that we can have peace in our land forever. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the nation of Israel comes to Samuel and they say, I'm going to read this whole chapter. It's not super long, but just bear with me. When Samuel became old, this is in 1 Samuel chapter 8, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and his second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. So Israel wants to be like everybody else. They want to have a king like every other nation. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being a king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so that they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. And God's about to show them what they're going to get if they get a king, because they want a king. And God says, hey, listen, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. Now, just for a minute, think about this in the context of these other religions, being a Muslim or being a Jew. The Muslims point to Muhammad, who was a king for them. He fought battles for them. He conquered nations for them. He was a king who, with a sword, went and brought peace to the nation of Islam, to the Muslim community. They were looking for a human man to go do battle for them in order to fight their battles. They weren't looking for God. They were looking for a man. Similarly, to this day, Israel is looking for a king, looking for a Messiah to judge them, a human being to bring peace to their country, to fight their battles. Christians have a distinguishing idea about this because we believe that Jesus Christ is king. Let's get to that in a minute. So 1 Samuel chapter 8 continues in verse 10. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who are asking for a king from him. He said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and the vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in the day that you cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Why? Because you asked for it. God says, you're going to get a king. I'll give you a king, but you're going to get a king. You're going to get somebody who's going to enslave you. Verse 19, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be what? Like all the nations. You hear that before? We want to be like the nations. No, we want to be like the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So why did the idea of the Christ come into existence? It's because it was appointed for the king to be anointed with oil. That is, in fact, what this word mashach in Hebrew means, to smear with oil. And that's what you have to do when you're made a king. The high priest has to anoint you with oil. In fact, this happens in England to this day. I don't know if you know this or not, but the Queen of Elizabeth was anointed with olive oil to be the Queen of England whenever she was crowned queen. Okay, that's one of the things the Church of England did to her. They put oil on her to represent that the oil of God's blessing had anointed her, and she became the Christ of England. Okay, the King of England, the Queen of England, the one anointed to reign as queen over that nation. So Samuel, he goes out and he finds the king that God has led him to. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1, Saul is anointed king. And I think it's verse 1. I might have the wrong. Oh, I'm in the wrong spot on my computer. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him and said, has the Lord not anointed you to be prince over the people of Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of the surrounding enemies. Now catch on to that. You're going to save them from the enemies. That was what Saul had been anointed by God to do. The kingdom of Israel had asked for a king, and Saul became a king. But then Saul fell into sin. He didn't follow God. He made mistakes. Why? Because he's a human being. And because that's what human beings do. They make mistakes, don't they? But Saul was rightly anointed king over Israel. But when he fell away from God and was not acting righteously as God's anointed king, then God directed Samuel to another man. And in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. And of course, we're talking about King David here. And then as we scroll down to verses 10 through 12, Samuel's looking around. He says, are all your sons here? And he says, well, there's also the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send that one, that's David, and I will not leave until he comes. And so Jesse sends out, brings in David. And the Lord said to Samuel, arise, anoint him, anoint David, for this is the one that I want to anoint king over Israel. And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of the brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So here's King David. He's anointed king, and you know what? He turns out to be a really good king. In fact, Saul is still the anointed king when David is anointed king. Saul is still by rights the king of Israel. And that's a big part of the story between David and Saul. Is David has some opportunities to kill Saul, but David won't do it because he recognizes that God has anointed Saul to be king. Even though David had also been anointed, David would not lift up his hand against God's anointed king. But instead, what ended up happening? Well, guess what? Saul affected his own death. And in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 4 through 5, Saul is in battle against the Philistines, and he's about to get killed by the Philistines. They're surrounding him with bowmen and arrows and all this, and he's afraid for his life because he doesn't want to be killed by his enemy and tortured by his enemies. So what does he do? Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor bearer would not do this, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. What kind of king is that? What kind of brave and righteous king is that? He wasn't a good man. He didn't rise up and take the place of authority that God had placed him in to fight the battles for the people that God had placed over him. And how does Saul's life end? It ends in suicide because he's afraid of his enemies. He's afraid that his enemies will kill him. So that is Saul. Now, David, on the other hand, won't raise his hand up against Saul. So in that way, David's a better king. And after Saul dies, David becomes king of Israel, and he fights a lot of battles, and he's really brave and all that. We can get on with Dave's stories. But guess what else happened to David? David also died. David also grew old. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But in the meantime, as David was growing older, he'd fought the battles, and he was ready to build a temple for God. He said, "Lord, I've created peace here in the house of Israel, but now I want to build you a house. I want to build you a temple." And he seeks God about that. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning of the chapter, David says, "You know what? I live in a house of cedar, but the Lord dwells in this tabernacle, this tent we've constructed all the way back from the days of Moses when we were moving about in the wilderness." He says, "It's not good that I'm dwelling in this nice house and God's dwelling in a tent." And he wants to build a tabernacle. He wants to build a temple for God. And so he asked God about this, and God answers him in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 8 through 16. And God says, I took you from the pasture from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled, you lie down with your fathers. I will raise up offspring after you who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish a throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This is the prophecy that the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians look toward for the coming of the Christ, for the coming of the anointed king, for the coming of the Messiah who would establish peace in Israel forever and ever. This is what we mean when we talk about Jesus being the Christ. And when you look at the New Testament, when you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and all that kind of stuff, a big question in there is, hey, Jesus, are you the Christ? Are you the one that was prophesied? Are you the one that was coming? And Jesus interacts with that a little bit. But this is the study that we're doing this morning to understand what the Christ actually is. It's an anointed king who is sent to be ruler over Israel. And there's a lot of other prophecies in the Old Testament that we can seek out about the Christ, but this is really it. This is where it begins. When God says to David that he's going to send a king, and God says a lot of things about that man that we see Jesus Christ in, right? He says, I will discipline him with the rod of men. I will discipline him with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him. But his kingdom will be established forever. And that's the sticking point for the modern day Jew. They say, you know what? Jesus did not establish peace in Israel, so he can't be the Christ. That's the argument. So when you listen to people who are Jews today, and they will make the argument, well, Jesus is not the Christ because he did not establish eternal peace in Israel. That's basically what the argument is. Anyway, David does die, and initially they thought that Solomon, his son, might be that king. And you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 38 through 40. That's exactly what happens, is that they bring in the oil. Zadok the priest, in verse 39 of chapter 1, took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. The main reason I want to point that out is that's the Christ, making Solomon Christ. Okay, that's not heretical to say that. We believe that Jesus is Christ today, but Solomon was Christ back then because Solomon was anointed to be king over Israel. All right, Jesus is the Christ that was prophesied, the Son of God, the Son of David. That's why they call him the Son of David when he's coming into Jerusalem. But Jesus is the Christ, but Solomon was anointed just like Saul was, just like David was, to be king over Israel. And then after this, Solomon builds the temple. But Solomon also falls into sin because Solomon falls in love with many women and he likes to build them temples for their gods. And he is not being a righteous king because he's not following in all God's commandments. Okay, he's not the perfect king. What did God say? He said, I'm going to give your people a king because they're asking for a king. But what are they rebelling against? They're rebelling against me because they don't want me to be their king. Well, let's fast forward to Jesus. That's where we find the story of Jesus, right? When Jesus comes in to the picture, what happens? Well, we're coming up on Easter. A week from today is Easter Sunday. And as we think about that this week, we can think about what happened to Jesus. God sent them the King. God sent them the Christ. God sent them the one that was anointed to be king over them, the king that they had asked for. And God had fulfilled his promise and delivered that king. Now, just as Saul, what did Saul do with the king? What did King Saul do with the very first king that Israel was given? The king of Israel ordered the king of Israel to be put to death. The king of Israel picked up his own sword, and I'm talking about Saul here, to put himself to death because he could not take the burden that God had placed upon him to deliver Israel from their enemies. In fact, he was afraid of the enemies. But we have a second king of Israel. This is not a king of Israel that puts himself to death, but he's a king that Israel puts to death. That he'd come as a spotless lamb, and he had been led like a sheep to the slaughter. And as Paul reminds us, Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the nature of a servant, submitting himself to death, even the death on a cross. So that is what happens with Jesus. Now, after that, we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ every Sunday, and especially this coming Sunday, Easter Sunday. But after Jesus came and died and resurrected and ascended to heaven to be an eternal king forever, because King Saul died, didn't he? King David died, didn't he? King Solomon died. All these kings are dead. And this is the point that Peter makes in his first sermon in Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 29. We're going to gather around this passage. Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. In fact, you can look up the tomb of David. It's still there to this day. Now, there's questions about whether it's the actual original tomb or not, but there's still a tomb of the king of David in Israel, in Jerusalem. Being therefore a prophet, talking about David, and knowing that God had sworn an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of the Christ. He doesn't say Jesus, the resurrection of the Messiah, of the anointed king, that he was not abandoned to hell, to Hades, to death, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Peter and John and James and the disciples, they saw Jesus raised up from death. Being therefore exalted at the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured out this that you yourselves are seeing and hearing. So Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the anointed king. Jesus was alive in Acts chapter 2, 2,000 years ago, and Jesus is still alive today. Jesus is the King of Kings. Jesus is the Lord of Lords. He not will be, but he is. Jesus' name, Yeshua, literally means the Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah is salvation. God himself saves us. Remember what God said to Samuel. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me from being a king over them. Here again, Israel rejects the Lord from being a king over them. But God won't let things stay that way. God will be king over his people, and he has sent his son, Jesus, to be the king forever and ever, not over Israel alone, but all the nations. Remember what they wanted to be like? They wanted to be like the other nations. God says, you know what? I'll do you one better. I'll give you a king, and he'll be king over your nation and every nation. That's what Paul understood. That's why Paul took the gospel to the Gentiles. That's why you and I, who are not from Israel, who are not Jewish for the most part, can be under the lordship of the King of heaven, Jesus Christ. We believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament to be the king over us forever and ever. Now, there's one more thing I want to leave you with before we close out for today. As the disciples are gathering and seeking the Lord after Jesus has ascended into heaven, there's a lot of conversation about the right way to follow God, the people that we should be listening to and the people we should not be listening to. And there was prophecy that there would be people who would rise up in the place of Jesus and say, you should follow me. Okay, you should follow me because I'm sent by God to be your leader. And this person they refer to as the Antichrist. And so there's just a real quick test we can do to decide and to decipher whether or not somebody is of God or not. And this is something that I hold really fast to. It's my number one rule when I have to decide whether or not somebody is from God or from the devil. And it's really clear here in 1 John. You can read all of 1 John because it addresses this quite a bit. But in 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, it says, who is a liar, or who is the liar, but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father, and whoever confesses his Son has the Father also. You cannot be from God if you deny that Jesus is the Christ. If you deny that Jesus is the Christ, you are not following God. God says, I want to be your king. I want you to turn to me to judge you. I want you to turn to me to get rid of your enemies. I want you to turn to me to be provisional from you. And I have sent you my very Son, Jesus Christ, to provide for you, to reign over you, to judge over you, to be merciful to you, to be compassionate over you, to give you things and not take things from you. Because what does God say about an earthly king? They're going to take from you. They're going to enslave you into their armies. They're going to charge you taxes. They're going to put burdens on you. They're going to take your sons and daughters away from you. That's not what God does. God adds to you. God doesn't subtract from you. God gives to you. He doesn't take away from you. And that's why Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the servant of God, the servant of mankind, gives to us, serves us, blesses us. What a great thing to have a king who gives to us and serves us and doesn't take away from us. I'm going to read one more passage from 1 John. This is in 1 John chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. One more test. Okay, first test. If you deny Jesus is the Christ, then you're in the wrong team. Here's another test. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and which is in the world already. If you deny that Jesus is the Messiah, then you're not from God. That spirit's not from God. If you deny that Jesus even came in the flesh, there's a lot of people today denying that Jesus even came in the flesh. Jesus came in the flesh. He suffered and died. He was resurrected. He is the Lord. He is the Messiah. He points us to the one true eternal God. Please, brothers and sisters, be discerning of these spirits. I believe there's going to be a lot of temptation here in the next days and weeks and months and years to be led to put your trust in a God that is not our God, to put your faith and trust in a government that is not a government of God. You know, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were told by their king to bow down to the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar and threatened with death if they did not do that. They said, you know what? You can put us in the fire and we might die and we might not, but we're not going to bow down to that false God. There's one God. There's one King. There's one Messiah, Jesus Christ. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. That is the litmus test for every Christian, for every believer, for anybody who hears of the Spirit of God. So I encourage you with that word this morning as we approach the Easter season. Let's remember Jesus not just as the sacrifice for sin, not just as our Redeemer, not just as our great high priest, and all of these things he is, but most importantly, that Jesus Christ is, was, and always will be the King of Israel, the King of all the nations, the King of kings, and the Lord of lords. May the grace and peace of that King be with you today and forever. Amen.